For example, there's some companies in the US, some biotechs, that essentially celebrate failure or celebrate when a product is terminated, because it is a decision. And in healthcare, you have to be very decisive, and you essentially look at facts and then you decide, is this really well worth it? Are we competitive to our competition?
G'day and welcome back to Shares for Beginners. I'm Phil Muscatello. One of the things that I most enjoy about making this podcast is delving into all the nooks and crannies of investment markets. And one of the areas that has come to the fore lately is, of course, the health sector. So my guest today is Dr. Bianca Ogden, who is a fund manager at Platinum Asset Management. Bianca is originally a virologist who now runs Platinum's healthcare fund. She has a unique perspective from a medical and an investment point of view. G'day, Bianca.
Hi, thank you for having me. That's exciting.
No worries. Thanks very much.
To explain what I do.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming on. So tell us a bit about your background. How did you start in virology?
I grew up in Germany, and during my time at school, or at high school, as you would call it here, I had a biology teacher who was very much into molecular biology at the time. So it was in the 80s, essentially. And at the time, you had HIV start to emerge. And one thing he did in our classes was he really often did real-life issues in healthcare that were coming up. And so we delved quite into detail about this virus and what viruses are. And that kind of started my almost obsession with this area. And from there, I was lucky because where I grew up in the next town was it's called the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, which basically looks at every vaccine that gets approved in Germany. And they had these lectures that were basically looking into HIV and what the current research was looking like. And I dragged my dad, because we couldn't drive at the time, dragged my dad with me to sit through these lectures. And I never looked back. I thought that was quite fascinating, how these little creatures, they're not really creatures, but these little subjects could cause so much havoc. And that kind of started me on my way to virology, really. And from then on, I basically selected a university that had a virology degree or offered a virology degree. There are not that many around, really, that focused on that. And, never looked back, really.
And you had something to do with a particular drug that was used in HIV treatment.
Yes. So I did worked for a little while at Novartis in Switzerland, and I worked in the team that was looking at new drugs for HIV. And one of the drugs that we were looking at is today is available on the market and that people actually use. It's not as good anymore because there's new ones, but it is available as for generic use. So it's quite exciting how that all works, the whole process, how from start to finish, really.
So how did the transition take place, going from virology into becoming a funds manager?
Yeah, the transition.
It's quite a leap.
Yeah, well, it is. It is. I call it the dark side, really. I think what I was fascinated while working at, particularly at Novartis, we had weekly meetings with all the different project leaders. And one of the things that I found fascinating is how these guys made decisions on what to basically move forward into clinical trials or what to look at. And it was such a diverse set of, I think, areas that they were looking at. One was looking at oncology, the other one was looking at virology, then there were others looking at obesity and all sorts of different things. And I thought, well, that's quite interesting. How do they do that and how does that work? And when you're in the lab, you work in your little kind of area, and most of the time things don't work and you're not as exposed to everything else. And so I somehow got interested into the share market also by looking at tools that I used in the lab and then following up what companies do that and started to invest. And out of that was probably always an interest in financial markets and what they do. And in the end, the ultimate change that happened was, I think J&J sent me to a conference at some local conference here in Australia, which is all about business development in different areas. And they sent me as a representative because Johnson & Johnson was sponsoring it. And someone approached me and said, would I be interested? And I went to and thought, oh, why not? I give it a go. I didn't know what that was really all about. And I can remember when I met Care for the first time, I got a bit worried about it because I said to him, like, oh, well, can I just come in for a day and look, how this works? And he immediately said, no, you can't. And I thought, that's a bit strange. But in the end, it was more, he knew if I come in, I would find it really strange and probably would never join. And he probably was right, because the jargon that people use in the financial industry is very different to what a scientist use. They find my jargon different. But that kind of, in the end, I took the plunge. I always had in the back of my mind, and I always said to Care, what would I do if I can't, don't like it? And he said, well, we then find you something else. It's okay. But yeah, in the end, I went there. I think I didn't like this first 6 months because of the jargon, and neither did they, I think, my colleagues. But yeah, that was it was more like a gradual transition, but it was all about, I wanted to understand how CEOs and companies really make a decision in really deploying a lot of capital and making pipeline decisions.
Kerr Nelson is the founder of Platinum Asset Management. That's who was tempting you to come into the industry. Yes. So he was convincing me, and didn't let me come to have a test ride, but in the end, I did the right thing. You touched on just a moment ago that the way that you looked at viruses, there may have been some similarities, or how the science worked. There may be some similarities with financial markets as well. Did you bring anything from the science background, apart from your knowledge of virology, of course, but to the way markets work?
I think it's one thing I, particularly in the last 6 months during this pandemic, what really surprised me was I can remember. So scientists are very fact-driven. So they look at facts and then they have a hypothesis and then they determine it, and they're very critical of what they do. In financial markets, it's almost the opposite. It's more about the story, and don't let the facts get in the way of a story. And I can remember that I was very surprised. Every morning we had a morning meeting. We still have. And people were saying, this company should be growing at about 5% earnings. Or some say, at 5 to 10%. I just couldn't understand why people just always said 5 to 10%. And I guess what I then realized is that these people, it's not very scientific. It's much more like it's about a story. It's about the future. But I think when you look at, as a scientist, you're very analytical, and you actually can pinpoint trends quite well, and you can decipher that. And that's the kind of an advantage that I have, and I bring that to the market. And what I've learned in the last 6 months is that there's a lot of rumors, a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of people follow it. Whereas if you stick to the facts, and it will play out in the end. So I guess it's different, but you still, with an analytical brain, you bring that to it, and that helps quite a lot.
Can you give us a bit of an overview of the healthcare sector? Now, you invest internationally, but just to give us an idea of the size, what's the relative size of our local sector compared to the rest of the world?
I think when you look at the healthcare spending that happens in Australia, I think to globally it looks it is between 1 or 2% really of the global market that Australia spends on healthcare. So it's relatively small, but it is obviously a thriving sector, and there's a lot more being spent over time. And what we actually have here is there's quite a lot of science being done. But one of the things that is lacking here a lot is venture capital, like a good system. And that is difficult because it is a small market, and everything essentially has to go overseas, because that's where the bigger money is really to be made. But it's an interesting market. We follow it closely, particularly in healthcare, particularly what's going on in innovation, trying to understand what's happening. But overall, it is relatively small compared to everywhere else.
And I believe now CSL, which is a healthcare stock, is the biggest share on the ASX.
Yeah. So CSL is kind of the poster child of Australia in terms of the healthcare sector. And they have done remarkably well, and they have a very good business model, and they're in the plasma business in particular, as well as in the flu vaccine. But yeah, they're like the big poster child.
What is it? I heard that they farm blood. That's their business model.
That's basically, yeah. That's right. That's like, while everyone knows about iron ore and all of those, they basically do that with blood, and basically extract all sorts of things out of blood.
The healthcare sector has a large range of investments. I mean, it's all the way from research through to hospitals, and much from the smallest to the biggest kind of companies.
Yes. So I always say, because people always look at it, we don't really want to talk about healthcare because it's about a disease, and it's not usually not nice. But on the other flip side, it is essentially a consumer market because we are consumers of this system. And when you then look at it and say, okay, so we go to the doctor, we go to the hospital, there's in and out patient services. And if you look at it like that, it's sometimes easier to understand what's going on. So you as a consumer go there and then they tell you what to buy, essentially. They give you a script and you go to the pharmacy and fill your script. Or these days you can also go into, maybe you need an over-the-counter drug, so you can buy it at Coles or Woolworths. So that's kind of you as the consumer. Now, these products that you buy or the services that come up or the devices that you need, an implant or even your dental checkups, all of these things that are being used, someone has innovated or has developed. And that's what we focus on. So we focus very much on innovation, on new drugs, on new devices. And what we also focus on, which some I think is not much appreciated, is also what people in the labs or the scientists that actually come up with these new inventions, the tools that they need to use to drill deeper into a disease or to come up with a new crown material. We look at these tool companies as well, and they're very interesting because they usually have technologies that later become drugs. So we try and get them very early and then sit with them on the journey. So there's lots of different subsectors, but we very much focus on innovation, and that's the core of what this fund is all about.
Can you give us a bit of an example, perhaps, of one of your favourite investments in this area?
Okay. We have one overlaying theme that I think ever since I joined Platinum 15 plus years ago, we believe that over time, the best thing to tackle a disease is to detect it really, really early, essentially almost when it hasn't even shown its true colours. And so that area of diagnostic, we're big fans of. And so we have, several years ago, had an investment in a company called Foundation Medicine. And they basically said, well, we're going to come out with a DNA test or tests where we look at the genome or we profile the cancer. And so they set that all up. And they built a lot of databases linking different profiles of a cancer to drugs and watching those outcomes. At the time, the market, it was listed in the US. It's a US biotech. We invested in it at about 500 million market cap. And at the time, the market was very worried that that test would be too expensive, it wouldn't be reimbursed, and it's just basically just focused on those things. Yeah, and we surely agree it was an issue. But to us, there was much bigger play to be had because this company had a big relationship with Roche Diagnostic, which is one of the biggest diagnostic providers globally. And we knew that Roche had quite big plans with this company. So we thought, no, let's not focus on the short term. One day they will get the reimbursement. There will be some settlement on what the price will be. And lo and behold, that all paid out. And in the end, the company was acquired for $5 billion. I think it was $5+ billion by Roche Diagnostics. And so we tried to really pinpoint these themes quite early on. And we've got a couple of those similar kind of stories in the fund. And we sit with them and we basically go on a journey. There will be ups and downs, but usually the downs are pretty good for us to add a little bit more to the position. But it is that thinking, how does healthcare and how does the change in the next 5 years, what will really happen? So there's digital, there's different things. So when we, for example, meet companies, we have like a dialogue with them, trying to understand where they're coming from. Also, we sometimes see smaller companies where we can say, oh, how does that fit into your environment? What do you do? So that's probably a good representative idea of what we do and how we do things.
I've read that in the healthcare sector, the hit ratio is the important thing because there's going to be lots of hits and misses. And it comes to a point that you've spoken about before, which is how failure is a key part of this industry.
I look at failure quite differently. I can assure you that when I wake up in the morning, because usually things happen for us overnight because it's international, and something has failed, it isn't a great feeling. And you feel like, But for example, there's some companies in the US, some biotechs that essentially celebrate failure or celebrate when a product is terminated because it is a decision. And in healthcare, you have to be very decisive and you essentially look at facts And then you decide, is this really well worth it? Are we competitive to our competition? And you learn from it. That's the biggest thing, because when I was in the lab, basically 90% of your experiments fail. So you constantly have to pick yourself up and think about, okay, how about I do it this way? What's happening? Is the hypothesis wrong? So you learn from it. And the biggest and best investments for us have been in companies that basically had a setback, but they do have a very solid scientific core to them. They have a very good team, and they can pivot to kind of their next pipeline product. And in those situations, you essentially just have to decide, do I think the core is still okay? Or is there something wrong with the approach that this company is taking? That usually helps us to then put more money in, and essentially out of that, we tend to make quite a lot more, because it doesn't really mean that everything fails if one thing fails, but it's also important for us to have the conversation with them and say, well, why did it fail? Explain to us, and what did we learn from that? And I think that's key. So I see failure quite differently, and it doesn't feel right at that time in that moment. But in the end, you have to then see the opportunity for the coming years, what you do. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that you always know what the company is actually about, and not just to play some catalyst. And a lot of people do that. I don't, and we don't really do that.
So valuing companies in this sector is obviously a very different skill to how companies are valued in other sectors.
Yeah.
How difficult it is to value investments in the healthcare sector?
I have a framework that I developed probably for my career. And the framework is you essentially, in my head, you have like a 3D image of a lot of the companies that exist in biotech in the world. And you tend to have an idea of what have they, who are they, and what's their valuation. And out of that, you then assign each of them your own valuation. So a lot of people do DCFs or cash flow analysis. To me, yes, you can do that and you get some kind of ballpark out of it. But in the end, a drug tends to either work or it doesn't. So even assigning a percentage point to it, it doesn't really work. So I do have usually quite firm belief in either technologies or in drugs. And I usually have a firm belief in the team. So to me, the people behind these companies are very important to understand, and how they make decisions. And I've learned a lot I like them usually to fall over, because then I can really see how good they are at making different decisions.
Yeah, because they're famous for burning through cash stocks in this sector, aren't they?
Yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of people criticize them for that.
Yeah.
But I've learned that if we struggle in Australia with this, if you don't have enough cash to actually explore your great product, you're not going to fail because your product is fake. You're just going to fail because no one gave you the money. And so we're seeing it at the moment a lot, that in particular in the US, which is very well funded, they can move very quickly and they can do the proper trials. And I think it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem, because here you may have the best molecule ever, but you don't have the money to do it. So I think while people always say, oh, you're spending too much, I say, well, you've got to look at it. Do you rather want them to do slowly, but they never will get there? Or do you actually want to get there? So it's again goes back, is the company just using the money to travel or have a nice life, or are they actually putting it really what they're supposed to do? So you have to understand that often companies do acquisitions, so you have to really look at, is that really the right way and that they're spending enough? So there's different ways to look at it if they spend the money wisely or not.
Okay, so my next question, of course, is we've got to touch on COVID-19 and the current situation. Yeah. And I originally said, is there going to be a vaccine? Do you think that we'll be able to find a vaccine? But then the second part I'd like to add to that question is it even necessary to have a vaccine? Is a treatment something that can help in this situation as well as a vaccine?
I think both would be great. I think there will be a vaccine coming out of this, because I think we have different ways of companies now trying to do vaccines. So it's not just one technology that they use. There's different companies using different technologies, and that's actually great to see, because each of them does it slightly different. We'll probably get a different response. And I don't think the first one we will see, the first vaccine, will be the best. I think it will transition us to the next stages or next generation of vaccines. So I think for a very normal life where we, for example, travel very easily and without thinking about this virus, I think we will require a vaccine. In terms of drugs, it would be great if we have something, for example, what we have for HIV, the different drugs that are available now that made that disease into a slightly different chronic disease than we had in the 80s. I think the two of them have to work together. So it is one of the issues always in pandemics is the patients that you have there will be less because we're dealing with it quite well, and then usually sometimes it can fizzle out. But with this, I think it is with us, so that gives companies a lot more patients to test it on, because with others the patients dried up very quickly. So I think we're getting there. And I think my thing from the start has been, so we've seen a couple of these coronavirus pandemics. So we had SARS, MERS, and now COVID. I think that is a bit of an indication that this coronavirus pandemic or epidemic is a little bit with us here for the long run. And we should really make sure that we have a vaccine as well as therapeutics available. So I'm all for it. I'm astounded by how much money has so quickly been mobilized into it. But that's, I guess, people really want to make sure that we can get back to as much normality as we can.
I've heard you in another interview talk about the way vaccines are changed, like the old style of vaccines compared to the newer ways of delivering vaccines into the system.
If you look at the vaccine industry, there have been 4 big dominant players, and they have been very, very good in making vaccines and also combination vaccines. And that has been gradually growing and growing. It's a great business to be in. What we, over the last, we've been looking at vaccines for the last decade, thought that why is there not much change in this industry? What's going on? And we then came across these companies which use a different kind of way of doing it, where you essentially can synthesize the vaccine itself and then use the human as the manufacturing side, which cuts out the vats that you need to make the vaccine in. And we thought that's a very clever way of doing it. And sure, the technology has to prove itself and you have to test it, but that's usually where biotech fits in. That's their bread and butter. And so we thought that was very interesting, and that could really change the industry. For example, someone this week was saying, I think a couple of years ago, someone said, well, we could maybe have, little vaccine shops in different places that then make these they're called mRNA vaccines potentially. So there's that, it's always a dream or a story initially, but then these companies get money and get behind it and really try and push the envelope. There's also different other ways of how you can make technologies, how you can make usually in a vaccine, you have to make one part of the vaccine that basically makes the immune response. And it's always about how do you make that most efficiently. And I think we're seeing different companies trying to do that. And that will change the face of the of vaccine. And that's what we were quite excited about last year, because it really slowly you get more and more data around it. And these companies have been able to raise money quite nicely. So that's what we're excited about. Again, it goes back to, we look at innovation, we look at different things that may not be so feasible today, but in years to come will become very interesting.
Sharesight is an online portfolio tracking tool that automatically records trades, dividends, ETF distributions, and gives you the reporting tools you need to help you manage your portfolio. Sharesight is pleased to extend a special offer to listeners of this podcast. 4 months free on an annual premium plan. Go to sharesight.com/shares for beginners and sign up now for a free trial before taking advantage of 4 free months. It'll help you save money at tax time and improve your investing decisions. That's sharesight.com/shares for beginners. Gee, no wonder you work in this sector.
Yeah,
it's
it's
such
exciting.
an interesting and exciting and fascinating place, isn't it?
It is. It is. It's a very, it's very relatively, there's always something to talk about. But when I first started, I went to a meeting with Clorox in the US with one of my colleagues. And we were talking about innovation at Clorox, who makes cleaning products. And they were so excited because they had an innovation of making a cleaning product smell orangey rather than lemony, and it's orange than lemon, and they thought that was the best thing, and I thought, like, that cannot be true. But so it's different innovation, but we're very much at the innovation side where it's really kind of exciting, and there's every day something new, and people push the envelope very much.
People who observe this sector notice that there can be quite wild swings in the share price of some of these companies. So we're recording today on May 27th. We just should timestamp this because of the current situations and how things are moving so quickly. But, for example, last week, Moderna had a huge rise in its share price because there was an announcement about their vaccine. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so Moderna is one of those mRNA vaccine makers, and they have very quickly obviously embraced their technology and very quickly in January started making their vaccine contender. And they obviously moved very quickly into the clinic, and they showed, or they had a press release saying about some of the data that they got from their phase 1. And that caused a lot of excitement. Interestingly, the next day, it wasn't so exciting anymore. To be honest, we have been in this company since the IPO, which was 18 months ago. And to us, it was about what can you do in the vaccine industry. It wasn't about a pandemic. There's always in the back of your mind when you go into vaccines, there could be a pandemic, but that's just something that could happen. So we found the technology very interesting. We're also in their competitor, a German company called Bianca, because we believe that this mRNA technology has come a long way, and and we're seeing data now that could actually mean it has some legs to stand on. And what happened was a lot of people are not very basically say, well, we haven't seen the real data, it's a press release, and all the normal debates that you get in this sector. And the company has always been attracted to people that really dislike them. And we have always had very, very good interactions with the company. We have always been, we visited them, we visited their manufacturing side, we met their scientists, we read their papers. So we've done what we do, but it's obvious the share price has gone quite well. They then raised money, which we probably don't agree with that valuation, but that's for other people to decide. So we didn't participate, and we essentially have been trimming slightly some of the positions that we have, and that's what we do. So we look at valuation, we look at, what can they achieve. The debate is always what can they price it at. There's other vaccine developers out there. None of them can make it all for everyone. Biotechs, to be honest, at times generate a lot of emotional response in this, and this one in particular has a quite emotional response in people. But no, you have to keep quite level-headed in this space and really look at, where are we at? Where did that come from? And that's what we do.
You referred to having a 3D view of the industry. Is this an example of it where you're looking at one company that might be developing a particular technology, but then you also know about other companies that are working in the same space?
So I noticed it. So one of the things that I noticed that is very important is because there's so much going on, and there's a publicly listed companies that essentially have, that's one part of it, but there's a whole lot of private companies, academic labs, and you somehow have to have in your head all these different basically puzzle pieces. And in the end, you have to understand that, that's great. Let's use Moderna. They make a vaccine with the technology, but there's 2 German companies that are doing quite well with their technology. And on top of that, there's a Johnson & Johnson, there's several Chinese companies, there's so many different ones. And each of them has very good technology, and each of them is putting a lot of money behind it. So while everyone for some reason focuses on Moderna, you should also consider the other ones and understand them. So you have to do the hard work. And we do that in everything. We do that in breast cancer and lung cancer. And it's interesting. I always find that a lot of people just focus on one thing, but they forget that in 5 years' time, when you actually come to the market, things may have totally changed, and you need to take that into consideration. It's not easy for a generalist to do that, but that's why we're very specialized in that, to try really, really keep abreast of that and really move on and stay also very close to the industry to understand what is an AstraZeneca going to do, what is a CSL going to do. They have to think about how things pan out in 5 years' time. and they have to be ready for that.
If listeners are interested in finding out more about this fund, where can they go?
They can go on our website, which is www.platinum.com.au, and there is a part to it where you can click basically into our different funds that we have, and the one is the Platinum International Healthcare Fund. We write every quarter a quarterly update on all our funds, which is very interesting to read because it's basically every quarter I write about, and we write it ourselves, fund manager, each of us, what is going on in the industry, what we're looking at, different themes we're exploring. So it keeps you probably up to date with what's going on really overseas and globally, and how we really try and decipher it and stay ahead, really.
And Julian McCormack, who's been on this program a couple of times, he will want me to say as well, if before investing in any funds, read the PDS. That's
right, yes. Yeah, that gives you all the details about everything. That's right.
Okay, Bianca, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure meeting you and chatting with you. Finally, I've been trying to get you on the podcast for ages. Good. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was great. Thank you.
Shares for Beginners is for information and educational purposes only. It isn't financial advice, and you shouldn't buy or sell any investments based on what you've heard here. Any opinion or commentary is the view of the speaker only, not Shares for Beginners. This podcast doesn't replace professional advice regarding your personal financial needs, circumstances, or current situation. Thanks to Christopher Soulos for music production with that special Greekalicious flavour. Remember, music always flows, even when the money won't.